So good evening, everybody. This is, I don't know, the fourth or fifth or sixth event in a series on normative foundations in public policy. And we had quite a number of speakers and discussions in previous events in this series. And today it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Philippe Van Parijs from the University of Louvain, Belgium. And on behalf of the Dean, who is today out of town in official business, I have been asked to introduce our speaker. Which is a particular pleasure for me, as we know each other and have had the chance to do things together for 27 years or so. Philippe Van Parijs holds 2 doctorates in social science and philosophy from Oxford. He is a professor at the University of Louvain, where he holds a share of economic and social ethics. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard University and Oxford University, and also an amazing number of places, including Uruguay and the Russian Academy of Science and Beijing and Rio de Janeiro and so on. I'm not going to read all of them to you. He is, in 1986, a co-founder of what then was called Basic Income European Network, in the meantime renamed as Basic Income Earth Network, as it has 40 national chapters from all 5 continents now, which indicates that he is not just a creative thinker, but also an activist and organizer. This basic income network refers to the idea of an unconditional basic income as a right of citizenship. And Philippe has done a lot to develop and promote the idea and translate it into proposals for public policy. If you want to characterize the academic work of Professor Van Parijs, one is probably fair to say that he is intensely interested in economic and other forms of inequality, not just inequality between income classes, but also inequalities and the questions of justice involved in differences between nations, between linguistic communities, and so on. That will be clear in the lecture. He won the Franqui Prize, the highest Belgian academic award. He won even, as I learned today when preparing for this little introduction, he is also pictured on a Belgian letter stamp in a series of stamps honoring outstanding Belgian academics. Professor Van Parijs operates in 3 languages, Dutch, French, English, although he speaks 7, I think. His most important books are the 1995 volume Real Freedom for All, with one chapter, one part being titled Undominated Diversity, and I think that is a leitmotif of much of his writing. Another 2011 book is Just Democracy, a collection on writings in political theory. And another one, also 2011, is linguistic justice. I think he is a fine example for a rule that I think is a rule or a regularity, namely that the experience of living in deeply divided societies, such as Belgium, linguistically and economically divided, has an inspiring effect for accomplishments in the field of political theory. And one might draw parallels, Israel, Yael Tamir and others, Canada, Charles Taylor and Bill Kimmelka, Europe, Joe Weiler and Habermas, and on the same way of penetrating analytical thoughts, one could add Philippe Van Parijs in Belgium. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight.
So, guten Abend, liebe Damen und Herren. I understand that in this institution the rule is that one should speak what President Joachim Gauck recently called praktikables English, und das werde ich auch heute Abend tun. Right, thank you first to Claus Offe. Indeed, I've known him for a long time, even though my first acquaintance with him was when I was a student in Bielefeld for one semester. And you know what Herr Professor Doctor is in Germany, so I didn't dare to talk to him even once. But later, not because he intimidated all the students, but because I was a shy foreign student who therefore didn't dare to ask even one question to him. Anyway, later we made up for that, and as he reminded us, we were together to found in a very long time ago, 1986, the Basic Income European Network became Basic Income Earth Network and is still very much alive, and a tiny aspect of what I'm going to say tonight has some relationship to that. So let me first ask, in order to see what I can assume by way of background, who among you has heard of John Rawls? Those stick their finger up. All right, so nearly everyone, but not quite everyone. So, okay, so I'll provide a little bit, I'll be a bit more explicit than in other contexts than at some junctures. So let me see if this works. No. Yeah, there we are. This is what I'm going to talk about. Right. So the last time I met John Rawls, that was in the spring of 1998. He had sent to me the manuscript of a little book, his last little book called The Law of Peoples, and we had at his house in Lexington a very long discussion about it, which enabled me to express my deep malaise about the central claims in the book. Deep malaise that no doubt were linked to the fact that I was, as Claus just mentioned, a Belgian and a European. In particular, I was bothered by the central importance which Rawls gave in framing his whole discussion of worldwide justice. That's the subject of that book. The central importance he gave to the notion of a people. The book is called The Law of Peoples. But what is my people? As a Belgian citizen, I was at the time living and working in Wallonia. Was my people the Walloon people? Was it the Belgian people, problematic country? Was it the European people? And what choice you make in this respect is of great importance for all sorts of distributive implications that follow in the book. So what I'm going to do today is I'll start in my first part by articulating the disagreements between Rawls and me by quoting from a long letter, and my reply to that letter, which John Rawls sent me then shortly after this encounter. So after we met, I sent him a letter that sort of spelled out more fully what I had been trying to say, and he replied, he sent back quite a long letter too, which is quite remarkable, not only because it's the only part, a little bit of his writings in which he discusses explicitly the European Union, but it also contains a passage which is no doubt the most anti-capitalist passage in his whole work. I asked him subsequently whether I could quote that particular passage, which he allowed me to do, and later on, after his death, his literary executors allowed me then to publish the whole of this correspondence. So this I'm going to use, then after that I'll sort of frame these controversies and these disagreements in the very rich discussion on global justice, which has been taking place in the last 15 years or so. That will be point 2. And then against that background, I'll present what will be the core of what I want to submit to discussion, namely these 4 views on what we mean when we talk about social justice in the European Union, as we've tended to do more than ever as a result of the crisis in the Eurozone. Then, more briefly, if time allows, I'll focus on a question that looks very much like question number 2 there, and is often confused with it, but is crucially different, nevertheless very important. And then, if I have time, I may just mention somewhat more concretely 2 directions in which I believe it is important to go. Let's start then with this correspondence. So there are basically 3 disagreements. The first one, Rawls introduces as follows. Now, after some time, he says, towards the beginning of the letter, I'm back trying to complete the law of peoples and hope the end is in sight. However, I wouldn't feel comfortable about the law of peoples until I can formulate a reasonable reply to your long letter to me, together with the enclosures, which are extremely helpful indeed. I believe that you interpret the law of peoples differently from me, which means wrongly, of course, because who knows what he means, what an author means except the author himself. Thus, suppose that 2 or more of the liberal democratic societies of Europe, say Belgium and the Netherlands, or these 2 together with France and Germany, decide they want to join and form a single society or a single federal union. Assuming they are all liberal societies, any such union must be agreed to by an election in which in each society the decision whether to unite is thoroughly discussed. Moreover, since these societies are liberal, by the law of peoples they adopt a liberal political conception of justice, which has the 3 characteristic kinds of principle, as well as satisfying the criterion of reciprocity. Criterion of reciprocity for Rawls is formulated as terms of cooperation reasonable for all to accept as free and equal persons. De facto, what it means here, that this new society, like any liberal society, would adopt a distributive principle that may not quite be the 2 distributive principles that Rawls proposed in A Theory of Justice, but would be a variant from it. That is some sort of egalitarian conception of distributive justice. The principle, the variant, the version of that egalitarian principle of distributive justice, which Rawls himself proposed, is the so-called difference principle, and which is a principle that says that there can be inequalities of social and economic advantages in society in terms of income and wealth and power, providing these inequalities help increase the expectations in terms of these advantages of the worst off. So inequalities in income, wealth, power are okay. They can be just, they can be justified if they contribute to improve the situation in terms of income, wealth, power of the worst off. Okay? That's a highly egalitarian principle. It doesn't say that you have to equalize at all costs, but it says that inequalities are only justified if even the victims of these inequalities benefit from it. So that's a strongly egalitarian distributive principle, which is at the core of the distributive aspect of his famous theory of justice, published in 1971, long before the Law of Peoples, which really was the starting point of contemporary political philosophy. Okay, so he says, if Belgium and the Netherlands and France and Germany want to form a society together after an election, they can then adopt then one variant of this principle or the institutions that follow from this principle. Here he says, we have a division of labor between the law of peoples, which is to serve as a scheme of norms for international law and practice, and the decisions of free and equal citizens in liberal societies. I don't feel that this division of labor, once it is correctly understood, is stingy, because I had the letter to which he replies, I had said, well, your view is stingy because it doesn't endorse principle of distributive justice at a level that goes beyond the level of nation states. You write, he continues, as if what I call later the duty of assistance is relevant to the situation we are discussing. The duty of assistance is a duty for which he makes room in the law of peoples, which is only the only distributive component in his conception of justice on a world scale of the law of peoples. And this duty of assistance is a duty that needs to be fulfilled by the wealthier societies, the more affluent society, in order to help what he calls the burdened societies, that is, societies whose level of development is so low that they cannot sustain just institutions. They are so poor that they cannot sustain what they themselves would regard as the institutions of a so-called, what he calls a well-ordered society, and so just institution. You're right, he says, as if what I call the duty of assistance is relevant to the situation we are discussing. Yet that, however, is a misunderstanding. This duty of assistance applies to a separate matter, namely to the duty that liberal and decent peoples, affluent enough, have the duty they have to assist burdened societies, in the sense just described. These societies are neither liberal nor decent, and decent are sort of a weaker variant of what he calls liberal just societies, societies that somehow satisfy some minimal principles of decency without satisfying all the requirements of a liberal egalitarian society. What Belgium and the Netherlands owe to each other in a union between them cannot be a decision between, say, the difference principle on the one hand and the duty of assistance on the other. Perhaps I fail to grasp your meaning. To which I replied the following. Although the duty of assistance is not one that currently applies, say, to the Netherlands with respect to Belgium, and I could have said to Germany with respect to Greece. So, although the duty of assistance is not one that currently applies to the Netherlands with respect to Belgium, since Belgium cannot currently count as a burdened society, whose level of development is so low that it can't sustain just institutions, can't it nonetheless be said that the Netherlands have such a duty towards the Belgian population in the event circumstances led Belgium to be burdened in the appropriate sense? Since the duty of assistance is the only principle of the law of peoples which includes a significant redistributive dimension, it then seems to make sense to compare this weak distributive obligation of justice, which is currently not triggered, which holds between the Belgian and Dutch populations, if they are to be viewed as two different peoples, compared a duty of assistance if these two countries are two different peoples, compare that to the undoubtedly stronger distributive obligation of justice, which would hold if they were viewed as or became components of a single people. Admittedly, these obligations may be acceptably captured in your present view by a reasonable principle less egalitarian than the difference principle. Moreover, circumstances may be such that no net transfer would be mandated by the relevant principle. Nonetheless, it seems correct to say that in historical conditions under which the borders between people are up for challenge or redistribution, or redefinition, and where the borders between peoples are up for challenge or redefinition, there is a choice between linking people on different sides of some border by weaker or stronger distributive obligations, by sheer assistance or by the difference principle. And so my claim in the initial letter is that his view of global justice, if you want to call it that way, worldwide justice, was stingy because all that was needed between distinct peoples was this duty of assistance in extreme conditions, which is, of course, far less demanding than the difference principle, which says that you have to maximize the fate of the worst off. If you apply that worldwide, it's, of course, far less stingy, far more generous, far more demanding than the duty of assistance. Second point of disagreement, more briefly, he says, you are critical also of my use of the idea of the nation state, closely related to my malaise, which I mentioned before. But I think you overlook what I say about that idea in paragraph 2.1. There it says that the requirement that a liberal people have a common language, history, and culture with a shared historical consciousness is rarely, if ever, fully satisfied. Historical conquests and immigration have caused the intermingling of groups with different cultures and historical memories, who now reside within the territory of most contemporary liberal democratic governments. Despite this, the Law of People starts with this standard case. His book starts with this standard case of the pure sort of nation state. Perhaps if we begin with this standard case, we can work out political principles that will, in due course, enable us to deal with more difficult cases. In any event, a simple presentation using only liberal peoples as nations in this strict sense is not to be summarily dismissed, as I seem to do in that letter. In a matter so complex as the Law of Peoples, we must start with fairly simple models and see how far we can make them go. To which I replied, my challenge is not to the methodological priority of simpler cases, but to the substantive importance of the question of where the borders between peoples should be drawn. There may be some countries and episodes of history in which the location and meaning of borders are so intangible that they are tantamount to facts of nature. That's why I conjecture the very notion of people seems so unproblematic to a citizen of the United States like John Rawls. But there are many other countries, thinking of mine, and periods in which either the location of these borders or their meaning, or both, is under challenge or negotiation, at least as much as most of the domestic political and socio-economic institutions. This could be said, I believe, for the whole of the European Union today, particularly the Eurozone. And then it seems to me that we are entitled to expect from political philosophers something more specific about what the borders should be and what they should mean than the peoples must decide democratically, which is what Rawls says, essentially, just as they are expected to say something, just as political philosophers are expected to say something more specific than this about the just pattern of political and socio-economic institutions. Put in brackets, the fact that scholars in the Rawlsian tradition are prepared to stick their necks out in this way by offering substantive principles of justice, I have always regarded as a decisive advantage over the purely procedural Habermasian tradition. I'm very much on Rawls's side, as it were, in terms of methodology, that is, in terms, although the fundamental liberal egalitarian approach and intuitions are common to Rawls and Habermas, I'm very much on Rawls's side, sorry, as far as methodology is concerned, and the importance of spelling out principles of justice, and not simply spelling out the procedures leading to them. But at the same time, I'm very much on Habermas's side on the fate of Europe, and for reasons related to what I'll continue to say. So I'm not saying, so this is still in my reply to Rawls's modest response, saying, look, I'm not saying that all the states in the world are nation states. I agree this is an extreme case, but we must start from somewhere, and this is the simple case from which I start. So this is still what I'm responding to, and I continue by saying, so I'm not saying that the majority of complex cases should be treated before or on a par with the minority of simple cases. Rather, that they should alert us to these complex cases, to a practically important and logically prior question, which is which populations should be regarded as or turned into peoples or become more or less people-like than they currently are. Of course, these populations will and should decide themselves, but just as in the case of political and socio-economic institutions, is it not part of our role as political philosophers to guide these decisions? That's disagreement number 2. Finally, and that leads to the most striking passage in Rawls's response, finally the third disagreement. And listen. One question the Europeans should ask themselves. Most of you are Europeans, so this is a suggestion made by Rawls, 1998. One question the Europeans should ask themselves, if I may hazard a suggestion. He's always very modest in his, plus he's an American, he says, I don't want to meddle with what you do. So one question the Europeans should ask themselves is how far-reaching they want their union to be. It seems to me that much would be lost if the European Union became a federal union like the United States. Here, in the US, there is a common language of political discourse and a ready willingness to move from one state to another. Isn't there a conflict between a large, free, and open market comprising all of Europe and the individual nation states, each with its separate political and social institutions, historical memories, and forms and traditions of social policy? Surely there is probably great value to the citizens of these countries, and surely these are great value to the citizens of these countries and give meaning to their life. The large open market, including all of Europe, is aim of the large banks and the capitalist business class, whose main goal is simply larger profit. The idea of economic growth, onwards and upwards, with no specific end in sight, fits this class perfectly. If they speak about distribution, it's almost always in terms of trickle-down. The long-term result of this, which we already have in the United States, is a civil society awash in a meaningless consumerism of some kind. I cannot believe that that is what you want. So, you see, he finishes, I'm not happy about globalization as the banks and business class are pushing it. I accept John Stuart Mill's idea of the stationary state. I'm under no illusion that its time will ever come. Certainly not soon. But it is possible, and hence it has a place in what I call the idea of a realistic utopia. I hope this finds you well and happy to be home with your family. Very best. Jack. Okay. So, after having been interpellé, as we say in French in this way, what do I have to reply? I start off by saying I strongly agree with the underlying intuition. But isn't there something about the following argument held by left-of-center advocates of the so-called common and later single market, Jacques Delors, for example, getting rid of the inefficiency stemming from limited scale and local monopolies is, through the single market, is a good thing, providing the growth it generates improves the fate of the worst off in our respective countries. Of course, with the help of mechanisms that need to go far beyond spontaneous market trickle-down. Whether or not the above reasoning made sense at an earlier stage, we now have the single European market, and soon, 1998, the single European currency. And the transition costs of rolling them back seem high enough to believe them to be irreversible. In this context, is the erection of a genuine European polity that would encompass the European single market, I'm more difficult to understand than Rawls, I must say. In this context, it's my practicablest English that's not as good as his. In this context, is the erection of a genuine European polity that would encompass the European single market not far better than letting each national polity immersed in this market and beyond an increasingly globalized world market struggle with the latter's constraints, the constraint of this market? Of course, this would mean, that is, having this common polity, this would mean transforming the population of Europe into something like a people, a demos, not an ethnos. But this could and should be compatible with vigorous measures to protect their linguistic and hence cultural diversity, especially through a tough application of the territoriality principle for official language use, for public language use. Indeed, it would be essential, and so having this common polity, it would be essential to prevent a rapid erosion of their precious cultural differences under the crushing pressure of the obsession with the nation's competitive position, which would inexorably occur if we had the single market without anything resembling a single people, a single demos. If you have the single market without a single demos, you'll just have the market operating and eroding the differences between the various nation states, but eroding also solidarity within each of them. My suggestion, in other words, is that something more like the US, like the United States, in terms of political institutions, namely a stronger federal union, is required to prevent Europe becoming more like the United States in both social and cultural terms. So there's a paradox in it that I believe and that we need, because we have the single market, we need something that's more like what the United States have by way of polity in order to prevent our societies from becoming more like this meaningless consumerism that was described and stigmatized by Rawls. Okay, so don't worry, I'm apparently only in the first of 6 points which I announced, but this provides the background, and also don't panic with this graph. So now, in fact, and what I've said so far indicates enough what my substantive view was at the time, and if anything, my conviction has become even stronger along the lines of the disagreement I just expressed. But in the last 15 years, since Rawls's Law of Peoples was published, and partly as a result of that publication, there has been a very active debate on so-called global justice. That is, how should we think about distributive justice on a world scale? And some people, indeed, a number of sort of committed Rawlsian people in the Rawlsian tradition, regarded it as obvious that justice on a world scale should simply consist in the blowing up, in the sort of macrocosmic expansion of Rawls's, of the principles of justice, distributive justice, which Rawls proposed in a theory of justice for a particular society. In other words, something like the difference principle, maximize the fate of the worst off, should be applied on a world scale. People like Brian Barry or Charles Bates or Thomas Pogge are people who hold that sort of view. But to their surprise and to their chagrin, Rawls, as we just heard, didn't share that view at all, because for him it's not enough to have, for there to be, I see some words have been cut, but it's not enough for global justice, the egalitarian justice to apply, to have a common humanity, and that so-called cosmopolitan view. But this egalitarian justice between individuals can only make sense, is only triggered, this demand of egalitarian justice is only triggered between the citizens of a people, between the members of a people. And what is a people? A people is defined by a common culture and a common identity. So this, what he mentioned there, and the sharing of a language, sharing of a history, be it an imagined history, and this, what he calls explicitly fellow feeling, and the associated solidarity, which is closely linked to a common identity. Common culture, common identity are distinct, are not the same thing, but obviously they reinforce each other. So a people corresponds to what's there called a nation or an ethnos, and of course, for justice to be able to shape institutions, you need these institutions. So you need a state, you need what Rawls calls the basic structure, and the set of basic institutions, coercive institutions that are the subject of social justice. So you need a nation state, and to have really egalitarian justice, you need a society of people who regard each other as free and equal citizens. So therefore, you need a democratic nation state. And so distributive justice, so of the sort illustrated by egalitarian distributive justice of the sort illustrated by difference principle, only applies to the members, to the citizens of a democratic nation state. This makes Rawls, in fact, very close to so-called communitarians, people who believe that egalitarian justice can only hold between the members of a people defined by this common identity and this common culture. Now, the Law of Peoples articulates this view, and I've mentioned some of the reasons why I believe this is not acceptable. The other major reference in this whole discussion is an article by Thomas Nagel, published in 2005, under the title The Problem of Global Justice. What Nagel tries to do is, in a way, vindicate Rawls's ultimate conclusions, but by freeing these conclusions and Rawls's argument, Rawls's reasoning, from its holistic or communitarian premises, which Nagel believes are at odds, are in tension with Rawls's fundamentally individualistic approach as being a liberal, and in particular a liberal egalitarian. And so what Nagel says is that for egalitarian justice, egalitarian distributive justice to kick in, and for this demand to make sense, you don't need people. But what you do need is a population consisting of people, of individuals, subjected to the same coercive laws, and who are and regard themselves as the co-authors, the joint authors of these laws. That is, you need a state, and you need the common agora that is constitutive of a democratic state. And so therefore, the fundamental condition for global justice to apply, for egalitarian justice to make sense, is the existence of a democratic state. But you don't need a nation state, you don't need a people in this strong sense. My own view is intermediate, so I won't argue for it, I'll just mention it, is intermediate between the cosmopolitan view and the Nagel view. I believe that Nagel is right in saying that egalitarian justice only makes sense when some relations exist between people. But these relations can be much weaker than the existence of a common state covering all these people and the existence of a common agora, the working of, and the actual working of a democratic community. The weaker conditions are, one, the existence of what Jerry Cohen called the justificatory community, the fact that you regard other people all over, could be all over the world, as people who are entitled to asking you, why do you have so much more than I do? As soon as you allow for this sort of conversation, you form a justificatory community, and that's enough. It's a very weak form of the common agora. That's enough on that side, providing it's combined with something else, namely the existence of some coercive structures, which Rawls would call the basic structure, with a massive impact on people's lives. That doesn't need to be a common state, no common institutions. It's enough to have borders with all they mean in terms of shaping inequalities in this world. Borders which are obviously decided by a subset whose size and position and significance is decided by a subset of the human population, but which apply to others in a coercive way and are a massive determinant of their fate. So you can see that there are various positions in this space with people choosing different sets of conditions for egalitarian justice to be triggered. Let me then finish, so I'll skip the last three optional parts of my talk, even though we can return to that in discussion, by, against its background, then quickly indicating 4 different views that are currently more or less explicitly present in the discussion about social justice in the European Union. There are first 2 views that are held by people who, like Rawls or like Nagel, consider that in the European Union, the conditions necessary for egalitarian justice to make sense are not fulfilled. So that is in, so people who would say, well, you need a democratic nation states. Do we have that in the European Union? Certainly not. Do we have even something weaker like a real demos? Perhaps at the limit. A real state? Certainly not. So a number of people say these conditions are not satisfied, so therefore egalitarian distributive justice does not apply at the level of the European Union. Okay. Does it mean that there is no room for discussions about social justice? Yes, there is room for it, but then it takes 2 forms. One, both of them problematic, I should add. One consists in saying, well, yes, but justice at the level of the European Union is justice between member states. And how can we give a content to the justice between member states? Well, the European Union is a cooperative venture. States have come together in order to gain from cooperation to produce a cooperative surplus, and justice in this perspective consists in sharing in a fair way this cooperative surplus. Of course, you immediately hit the question of how we are going to work out what this cooperative surplus is. You need to have a counterfactual. What would be the situation of each member state if there were no part of the European Union, if the European Union didn't exist? Obviously a very complex matter. And 2, once you have some grip on this cooperative surplus and the way it is, in which it is currently distributed, you still need to work out a principle for the fair distribution of burdens and benefits. Problematic in all sorts of ways. Second view consists in saying, unlike the first view, there is no ex-ante redistribution, no altruism between the member states of the European Union. It's all about sharing a cooperative surplus. Right. Second view says, no, there's something like solidarity between peoples, and there may be a distributive duty towards others, towards member states, indeed towards other countries in general, out of solidarity, not just out of mutual interest in cooperation. And indeed, one version of that is the duty of assistance, Rawls's duty of assistance mentioned before. But of course, if all you can rely on is this duty of assistance, it's hard to justify an assistant, say, from Germany or from Belgium to Greece or even to Bulgaria, rather than, say, to countries that are obviously burdened, far more burdened than those, like the Congo, which has a GDP which is 100 times lower than the GDP per capita of the European Union. So, but these two notions are certainly present in the debate. Of course, from my perspective, we can be more ambitious. I do believe that we must think about social justice in the European Union as egalitarian justice between the citizens of the European Union. But there are two versions of that view, and I adopt the second one. The first view says, well, the reason why we need to think about distributive justice, egalitarian distributive justice between the members of the European Union is that the European Union is becoming a people in the relevant sense. If the relevant sense is people in Rawls's sense, a nation state, well, it means that the identity is, there is more of a European identity, there is more of a common European culture, and so therefore we need to think about, today we need to think about justice at the level of the European Union like domestic justice, nation level justice. That's one view, and then depending on which conditions you regard as crucial, and the claim must be these conditions are now fulfilled. I believe these conditions are not fulfilled. Europe is not a people in the relevant sense, in Rawls's sense, nor even in Nagel's weaker sense, because I believe that we must think about distributive justice, egalitarian distributive justice at the level of the world as a whole, because these conditions, justificatory community and common basic structure in the weak sense I mentioned before, are present on a world scale. But nevertheless, we must think about egalitarian justice and its institutions primarily at the level, for us, of the European Union, both because it's a sort of part of a gradual realization of global justice, be it on a regional scale, but also because we realize also with the crisis of the euro and many other crises that preceded it and that will follow it, that designing the right sort of institutions to handle the sort of diversity we have in a continent such as ours, and of course even more on the global scale, is a huge task. It's very difficult to imagine this institution, to see the perverse effects of a number of things we've done, and we need to learn from it. And the European Union is, of course, an unprecedented experiment that enables us to learn and to learn from our mistakes. So I will skip the other three parts. We can return to them in discussion, which may be partly some of the other parts were meant just to give a more concrete shape to some of the ideas that I suggested. But let me just finish by emphasizing two things. One is the great importance of thinking about these sort of issues in a multidisciplinary way, which is, of course, good music to the ears of people in an institution like this one, no doubt, where you need to think at the same time by drawing on the discussion in political philosophy, but also draw from the social sciences in all their diversity, from social linguistics to all the way to public finance. You need to think about all these aspects of the challenges we face and the solutions we may want to try to give to them in a deeply and constantly, permanently, chronically interdisciplinary way. And it's often not easy, and it's only possible if one does it collectively in institutions that encourage, and not only allow, but encourage this sort of interdisciplinary collaboration. And the second thing on which I want to finish, which I just on the plane as I came here, I finished reading a not really gloomy piece by Claus Offe, but not that optimistic piece about progress and notion of progress. And I agree with much of it, but I have sort of more militant, sort of optimistic sort of temperament or component in my temperament. I really believe in the importance of utopias, of utopian thinking, that is, of making projects for the future, which of course must not be the sort of grand utopias of the past. There must be sort of, in some sense, piecemeal engineering, improvements, and they must involve also a lot of thinking about the possible perverse effects of whatever we propose when we actually implement them. So we need to keep making, indulging in utopian thinking, but in critical utopian thinking. And if we do so, and if at the same time we are opportunistic, we use all sorts of opportunities in order to move forward, then it will be possible to give our children and our grandchildren a better future and a better life than what we've had ourselves. But in order to do so, we need, in order to make the lives of our children and grandchildren better than ours, we need to be sharper than our parents and our grandparents. And being sharper is in part doing this interdisciplinary work, which I mentioned before. That's what I wanted to say today. Dankeschön.